Hello, and welcome to the debut episode of Economy 2.0. My name is Josh Sidman. Economy 2.0 is a new series brought to you by the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. Episodes will air on the first Tuesday of every month, although we pushed back today's episode by a week since last Tuesday was Election Day. Before we introduce today's guest, I'd like to talk a little bit about the series. What is Economy 2.0? As a lifelong student of the economy, I believe we're approaching an inflection point in terms of how we think about and manage our economic lives. Our existing economic practices are leading to a variety of troubling outcomes, from growing wealth inequality to recurring economic crises, to geopolitical conflicts, to environmental issues which could threaten our survival. A growing number of people are coming to the conclusion that the status quo cannot and will not continue. No one really knows what the economy of the future will look like or how we'll get there. Will there be an abrupt collapse, or will it be a gradual transition? Will the trend toward globalization continue, or will the world fracture into competing power blocks? Will cryptocurrencies challenge national fiat currencies as forms of money? Is perpetual economic growth desirable or even possible on a planet with finite resources? As someone who's spent more than 15 years studying and promoting the ideas of Silvio Gesell, I have my own views about the causes of the challenges we're facing, as well as what should be done about them. Earlier this year, I was invited to give a course on Silvio Gesell at the Henry George School. It was a wonderful opportunity, but also an intimidating challenge. How would I present the ideas of Silvio Gesell to an organization dedicated to promoting the economic perspective of Henry George? A trend that I see not just in economics, but in many other important areas of life is that people are increasingly dividing and isolating themselves in informational silos. They read publications and watch content and have conversations only with people who share and reinforce their pre-existing perspectives. There's less and less dialogue happening between people who hold different views. This is an extremely counterproductive trend that is eroding the social fabric that holds us all together. I was excited and inspired by how the course at the Henry George School went. Despite the fact that there was a wide range of perspectives among the participants, every session of the course ended with a lengthy Q&A session in which there was a respectful and thought-provoking sharing of ideas. A number of the participants expressed a desire to find ways to continue such dialogue beyond the end of the course. This series is an outgrowth of those conversations. Economy 2.0 is not meant to promote any particular ideology or policy agenda. Rather, the premise is that whatever one's beliefs, we all benefit from dialogue, especially with people who see the world differently than we do. So first and foremost, this series is intended to be a forum for discussions about the economy, both where we are and where we're going. Unfortunately, in my experience, most people today are repelled by the subject of economics. They consider themselves unqualified to analyze the subject and form their own opinions. As a result, they put their trust in experts, people who they consider more knowledgeable and qualified than themselves. I think this is a very big problem. Silvio Gesell thought that this was a problem too. I'd like to read a passage from Gesell's Parable of Barataria. In it, he wrote, "We must respect our democratic institutions and refrain from introducing laws which are not fully understood by a majority of our people, however useful such institutions might prove to be. It would be a crime against democracy to obtain your acceptance merely by the confidence with which you honor me. Everything must be paid for in this world. The price of democracy is a travail of life's experience. We must see, observe, reflect, and learn. As Democrats, we must refuse to sanction anything we do not understand. As long as you do not act on your own judgment, but follow blindly the judgment of others. So long as you have no confidence in yourselves, but repose full confidence in a ruling class, you are not worthy of democracy. You are the fit prey for aristocrats. You can never establish institutions in advance of your mental horizon. Power over men is seldom, if ever, used for their advancement. The state should reflect the state of mind of the majority. You must learn to examine everything for yourselves and reach the best decisions of which you are capable. That may not give you ideal government, but it will give you the government you deserve. Do not aim at institutions beyond your mental capacity. If Gesell is right about this, it's not enough for experts to think about economics and come up with solutions for us. Because if we don't understand those solutions, the solutions won't work. The economy is not something that exists independently of us. We are the economy. And if we want to transform our economy, we must first transform our economic consciousness. So the first hurdle we must clear is our own reluctance to engage with the subject of economics. That's why the goal of Economy 2.0 is to have a conversation, not just a lecture in which experts come and tell us what to think. So while I know it's not necessarily comfortable to do, I hope all of you will push yourselves to overcome any resistance you might have to participating in the conversation. Because if we take Silvio Gesell's words to heart, that's a necessary step which must be taken before we can find and implement the solutions we need for a better economic future. Okay, before we get to today's guest, I want to mention that our next episode will be on Tuesday, December 3rd at 1 p.m. and will feature Tim Jenkin, a man with a life story so fascinating that it has been the subject of not just one movie, but two movies. Tim is the founder of the Community Exchange System, which is an alternative framework for facilitating economic exchange without the use of conventional money. I hope you'll join us for what I'm sure will be a fascinating conversation. All right, let me bring in today's guest. Steve Keen is a professor of economics from Australia, although he joins us today from Amsterdam. He's taught economics at the University of Western Sydney, Kingston University, and the University of New South Wales. He has an extensive bibliography, including a number of books, as well as many articles, both in the financial press and in academic economics journals. In recent years, he's attracted a large online audience, appearing on many popular podcasts, as well as creating a lot of his own content on his website, on Substack, and on other platforms. Steve focuses on critical issues like the environment and the monetary system, and he has some strong opinions about the economic future. When I was thinking about potential guests for this show, I couldn't think of anyone who would be better suited to set the tone for this series and kick off our exploration of Economy 2.0. So Steve, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Please help us kick off the conversation by sharing with us your thoughts on the current state of the economy, as well as where we're headed.
Oh, thanks, Josh. That's a lovely introduction. And my thoughts on where we're headed. They're fairly catastrophic. I'm far less worried about Trump being elected in America than I am about what climate change is going to do to the economy, not just in the distant future, but in the very short term. That's my main focus these days. But a large part of the problem about that is that the way people think about the economy, which is adopted, as you said, from the experts they trust who are neoclassical textbook writers, is completely wrong about the nature of the economy itself. It's like learning Ptolemaic astronomy and then in the age of space travel, completely inappropriate. And as a result of that, not only because of economists, we've ignored the dangers we face from climate change. They've also completely stuffed up how we understand how we finance and bring about something like a change from a fossil fuel-based system to a renewable energy-based system. So we've got enormous problems. So this really is a dramatic juncture point, as you said, in the economy and in human civilization. And we would be completely befuddled about what's going on if we continue being dominated by mainstream economists. So I'm actually I'm waiting for a question back from you, Josh. So I wasn't ready to give a presentation, so I thought I'd be having a dialogue with you.
Okay. Let me get myself back on the screen.
Yeah.
Well, while I figure out how to do that, I was wondering if you could comment. There we go.
Okay, good.
On that quote I just shared from Gesell, because to me, that is where it all starts. Is economics a subject for experts, or do you agree with what Gesell said, that even if experts were able to analyze the situation with complete information and complete wisdom, if they developed solutions that are not understood by the majority of the people, that those solutions would not work? What is your
Yeah.
opinion on that?
I think that's a fairly good starting point, because let's take one of the most obvious areas where people are where the experts are wrong, where people themselves and generally are more correct. But there's still a majority of people who misunderstand how money is created. So if you look at government spending, for example, one of the major issues in the most recent American election and in the UK election before that was all driven by beliefs that the government should not borrow money. That's true, it shouldn't, and it doesn't. When you look at the actual structure of spending, and I'm happy to share some of my Ravel software simulations to illustrate this point, the government doesn't borrow, it creates money. If a government has the capacity, has its own national currency and its own treasury and central bank, then with the mechanisms that provides, it creates money when it spends more than it gets back in taxation. And that's that is an empirical fact and a logical fact of double entry bookkeeping. Once you lay the double entry bookkeeping out, it's impossible not to conclude that governments create money by spending more than they get back in taxation, and that banks create money by lending more than they get back in repayments. Those things are just incontrovertible once you get the structure of the financial system right. The trouble is most people don't believe that's true. Most people believe the government borrows because, hey, look, the government's selling bonds. The bonds are a form of debt, so therefore the government must be borrowing from us to be able to do its spending. And that's an extremely common attitude, not just on right-wing circles, but on a lot of left-wing circles as well. You do the accounting and no, it's not what's happening at all. The government creates money by crediting bank accounts with spending by more than it takes out with taxation. That's number one. Then when it's done that, it's required by laws in most cases to sell bonds equivalent to the scale of the deficit plus the interest on outstanding bonds. And when you take a look at how that operation occurs in double entry bookkeeping, that is an asset swap on the bank side of their ledger, the asset side of the bank's ledger. So government bond sales in the very first instance enable banks to convert reserves into bonds. And that is actually a favorable trade for the banks. You'd be a stupid bank not to take it on, because the reserves used never to earn interest and now they earn a lower rate than bonds. So it's an advantageous in terms of income earning capacity. And and most banks, banks are also required to be bidding in that auction. And if there isn't sufficient reserves, then what the central bank does is buy bonds that are currently uh, held by private banks or non-bank financial institutions. And by buying those bonds back, it creates reserves. The sale of bonds, the purchase of bonds by the central bank ends up increasing the reserves of the banks. So that's a mechanism by which the government can make sure that that attempts to sell government bonds will always be fully subscribed, and normally they're oversubscribed. So all the stuff you hear about government borrowing money is a major reason why we've cut back on a huge amount of government spending. Uh, many programs, right from the Apollo program back in the 70s, right through to health and education in the United States and the UK now, are constrained by the belief the government shouldn't go into debt. Now, that's a constraint, which means we have less physical resources, less capacity to respond to climate change than we would have had if it hadn't been for this belief. So you have to convince the public as well, even if the experts are right. What is often advised by experts, and on this front I am an expert, sounds counterintuitive. Okay? So if you have to ask people to just think it sounds counterintuitive, they have to have confidence in it. My analogy of this is often this is like I'm an average driver. Okay, I don't think I'm above average, and one reason I know I'm not above average, I have no idea what to do if I get into a skid. Now, if you go and have a training, but I know what's necessary, but I can't make my body do it. And I know if you get in a skid, the way you control it is by turning your wheels into the skid. Now, that's counterintuitive for most people. So to be actually trained to know how to do it, you've got to go and do an expert driving course, put your car into a skid deliberately, have yourself overruled if you don't do a good enough job by the instructor, et cetera, et cetera. And then after that, yes, you know, if I get into a skid, even though it seems crazy, I'll turn the wheels into the skid and then I can control what I'm doing. So that sort of counterintuitive thing flows from a lot of elements of a correct understanding of how the economy operates. And just because the experts know it, it's difficult to get people to accept it as well. So yes, you've got to have both the experts and the vast majority of the population having that awareness.
All right. Well, let me just take a quick moment to mention, I thought we were going to have a presentation and then a Q&A. So since we've gone right into the Q&A,
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I
I
just want to
misunderstood the
mention,
original ideas.
yeah, that anybody who wants to ask a question or jump into the conversation, you can use the raise hand function, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar under the React tab. If you hit that, it'll let me know that you've got something you'd like to say, and I will bring everyone. I will bring those people in. One thing to mention is that if you have your camera turned off, I cannot add you to the screen that everybody is seeing. If you're more comfortable with that, that's fine. That just means we'll hear your voice, but we won't see you when you're asking the question. If you are okay with appearing on the screen to ask your question, then you'll need to turn on your camera. So I just want to ask Steve one follow-up question, and then we'll get to the number of hands that I already see raised. So Steve, you mentioned that it was an interesting comparison that, you know, how to deal with a skidding automobile and how to deal with economic challenges. What in your mind would be the economic equivalent to, say, an experiential driving course? How do we engage ordinary people in important and challenging economic subjects if we, again, go back to that Gesell quote and conclude that the solutions are not enough, that if the solutions are not really understood by the majority of the people, that they will not work? What would be a concrete example of something that ordinary people can do and participate in order to develop their own economic awareness and consciousness?
Yeah. Good question. Well, look, there's two things. Obviously, I'm now running online courses to teach my approach to economics, and some of the marketing seems a bit scammy. I haven't been able to convince the marketers to move completely away from their standard approach. But if you see anything from me with a woman involving a woman called Nicole or a thing called Steve Keen Free, it's genuine. It's not a scam, and at least the lectures I'm giving. And in that case, I'm giving people for a first principles approach to understanding economics. But a major part of this also is that, some people can do it, but it's not cheap. It's about $600. So I don't expect everybody on the planet to sign up to it. That's one reason I invented Ravel, because that's a software package which is a lot cheaper. We're selling that for $7 a month now, and that is something which people can actually use to check the accounting issues involved in monetary economics. And it's been designed in such a way that you don't even have to know you're building what are actually a set of differential equations, because most of the stuff ends up being very intimidating. If you actually see equations, it's extremely hard for people to, get over the intimidation factor. So what I might just do quickly, this is make up a bit for the fact that I misinterpreted you, Josh, and I didn't have a presentation ready. I might rapidly bring up Ravel and do a share screen and show how I compare my approach to monetary analysis with the approach the mainstream teaches. That'd be useful? Okay, here we
Great.
go. Okay, so I'll share my main screen. Now I've got a very complicated set of models there, so don't worry about those. I'll come back to those in a second, but I'll just show the basic. Oh, can only seen by Josh, I'm seeing in my shared screen can only be seen by the hosts and co-hosts. So I might actually stop the share and see if you can, let's see if you can provide capacity to share with everybody. Let's see, I'll try again. Sharing, same message, hosts and co-hosts.
Let's make you.
So
Let's make you.
yeah, make me a co-host. I think it
Okay.
might be the necessary thing.
Steve, can you? Sorry, Josh, could you do that?
Let's see.
Yeah, make as you first of all plan, Josh, make me a co-host, and that'll give me a chance to share so everybody can see it.
Let's see. Make co-host.
Yeah.
Okay. Done.
Okay, right, now I'll try. Okay, let's see how we go this time. So share screen, share. Okay, and now I'm not getting that message, so it should be okay. Well, everybody, hope you can see. Let's actually hide the meeting controls. You can see a very large blank screen. And instead of icons along here, this is the Ravel interface. What I'm going to do is just quickly show the essential part of the interface for monetary modeling, which we call a Godly table. So the way you build something in Minsky or Ravel, you click on the item, it's then attached to your mouse, you click on the screen and then place it on the screen. Then the basic story to Minsky's interface is, if in doubt, right click. If I click the right menu here, I get a menu coming up specific to a particular object, and so I can one of these is giving this thing a title. I'm going to call this banks. So this is seeing the economy from the bank's point of view. I'm then going to put this in what we call editor mode, which gives you a little double entry bookkeeping table where you can see what's happening over time. And I'll bring up the main menu for editing the tables, and that will affect what we see on screen. So I'm going to maximize that. And now what you're seeing is the fundamental way that banks work, and any financial institution works, by double entry bookkeeping. And the crazy thing is, economists don't learn double entry bookkeeping. They don't learn accounting, and their models are inconsistent with it. But being inconsistent with the accounting is like being inconsistent with the laws of thermodynamics. You're going to come up with bullshit and think it's profound. So I'm going to quickly create a very basic system for showing how banks operate. And of course, banks have reserves. So there's reserves, which are bank accounts of the private banks at the central bank. They issue loans and they buy bonds. So what I've got here is a setting that shows the three principal classes of assets that banks have. Then they have deposit accounts, and I could break them down into many different divisions, but I'll leave just with deposit accounts in general. And then the bank's net worth is the gap between their assets and their liabilities. Now, if I, for example, show banks lend from reserves, and this is what you'll be taught by economics textbooks. That's what they think banks do. That's what they call the money multiplier model. So I'm going to put some reserves in here. I'll put like initial value of 100 in reserves, and let's say 100 in bank assets. So there's no loans or anything else out there at the moment. Then I'm going to have minus like money coming out of the reserve account. So minus lend, and I'll make this all capitals here. Look, lend some reserves. So that's what it means. You take money out of reserves and give it to somebody else. So I got minus lend from reserves there. Let's try typing that in over here, because my mobile bank loan ends up going into your deposit account, doesn't it? And you get the result over here that the sum of this, according to the equation, assets minus liabilities minus equity equals 0, which is required to make an accounting statement accurate. It says, oh, you got a mistake. Okay. If reserve assets go down, reserve liabilities can't go up. The only way to balance this is to have a minus in front of there. And that means lending from reserves takes money out of your account. There's something badly wrong with the vision that conventional economists have. Now, ages ago, the Bank of England came out and said, look, there are heretics who claim that banks simply create reserves and create deposits at the same time. And that's known in the literature as endogenous money. Write up endogenous money here. What this says is the banks will make a loan, or banks will lend. So they put $7 billion into, let's say they might put $1 million into your bank account to buy a house. In the aggregate, in the American economy, they might put $1 or $2 trillion into people's bank accounts per year for all sorts of economic activities. So the deposits go up by lend, loans go up by lend. And that's accurate. Ravel says that's actually the accounting there is correct. So that's the simplest possible view of why the mainstream teaching about bank spending is inaccurate, and why the rebels, of whom I'm probably the leading rebel these days, are correct. And now let's imagine once you've got money, you're going to spend money. Or let's say you've got to pay interest, pardon me. And that, of course, doesn't mean money's going to come out of your bank account and go to the banks. So that's an absolutely simple vision of a monetary economy run by the private sector. But they also have the government spending. So that's going to be the government putting, so spend, and I'm going to make a subscript here, spend G for gov, going into deposit accounts. How do you balance that line? Well, that ends up, the only option you've got is to say, well, the bank's liabilities increased by deposits, the reserves increased by the same amount. So I type spend G here, and that's now showing, that's now correct. What about taxation? Well, that's money being taken out of your private bank account. And to balance that, it's also got to come out of reserves. So reserves fall because of taxation. That's correct. Then the government treasury bond sells bonds. So that's going to increase the value of bonds held by the private banks. So the treasury sells bonds. That increases the monetary value of bonds held by the private banks. Where do the funds come from? They come from over here. So what is actually used to buy treasury bonds is the reserves that are created by the government spending more than it takes back in taxation in the first place. Then you might include interest on bonds. That increases the amount of money in the banks have to spend. So I'll call this interest on B for subscript B for if you make it different for interest for private lending. And where does that come from? It's also created by the government by crediting reserves, which also increases the interest, increase the income of the banking sector. And then you'll have bank spending. So banks spend, let's say spend very slowly on the rest of the economy. So I'm going to have minus spend subscript B here and type spend subscript B here. And that's all accountingly correct. So what I've done is lay out a simple vision at the moment of how banks operate. And I haven't typed a single equation, you would have noticed. But in fact, Ravel is doing that for me in the background. So now I've got the bank's vision. How does that look like? Take a look at the private sector. So I'm going to name, pardon me, the tables. My screen gets a bit confused and I get the menu coming up off screen. So I'll call this private sector and I'll move it after I've typed it in. So this is private sector. Okay. Now you want to see, well, this is what the banks see. What do the private non-banks see? So let's make their table a bit bigger. And then right click and I bring up their table. And this is where the real magic of Ravel comes in, because so far what I've done you could do with a spreadsheet. Okay? There's nothing that's necessary to beyond. You could do all what I did in the previous table in a spreadsheet. But what's special about Ravel is that once you've defined something as an asset, it's a liability for somebody else. And once you've defined something as a liability, it's an asset for somebody else. So if I click on this little wedge here, I get a drop down arrow showing me the only liability I haven't yet allocated as an asset, deposits. So I click on deposits and all the operations I've typed in there come across automatically. I've also got a private sector borrowing, that's loans, so I can now bring that operation across. And now what I've got, so I'm looking at the private equity, private system equity. This is what the net worth of the non-bank financial system. And once I've typed that lot in there, everything else affects the equity. So I can instantly bring that across in Ravel. So now I've shown the banking system from the point of view of the banks and the private banking sector. Let's see it from the point of view of the central bank. So I'll call this central bank. Make that a table we can see on screen. Bring up its window. Now the same story applies. I've got assets which haven't yet been allocated but there are no liabilities outstanding I haven't allocated, but there are assets that I haven't allocated yet. So I click on the liabilities column and I get reserves. And we know reserves are a liability of the central bank. So now I call this CB equity. This is the net worth of the central bank. And all these transactions actually happen through another account. And I'll bring that up before I complete that. I'll just bring up that other system, because what I haven't yet got inside here is the treasury. So I'm going to, because of my menu system, I'll put this up so I can do it more easily at the top of the screen here. So editor mode for this one, title this treasury. Bring up its table. And I've got a liability of bonds. Okay, so the bonds are a liability of the central bank. So I've now got that entered there, but I don't have any asset for the treasury as yet. The treasury has what we call consolidated revenue fund at the central bank. So I type CRF there, and I'll say, well, the bond sales actually increase the amount of money in the Treasury's consolidated revenue fund. Where is that? That's actually at the central bank. So I can open that up, make that full screen. Now I've got an asset which hasn't yet been allocated. That's the CRF. So type CRF here. My mistake. I've got it as an asset. I tried to type as an asset. That's an error. I'll bring it up again. My mistake there. I meant to make it a liability. The Ravel stopped me making a mistake in that case. So there's the CRF. And now all the other operations also pass through there. So interest is paid out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund. Government spending comes out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund. And taxation boosts the Consolidated Revenue Fund. Just type tax there, pardon me. So having done all that, I've now got, and I've done it, I haven't actually finished fixing up the equity column of the treasury, because I didn't type treasury equity inside here, so I'll do that now. So treasury equity. And if I now tell the program to balance the close, I've now got that completely stated. So what I've done in about 5 minutes is build an accurate model of the financial system, where you can see from the point of view of the banks, the private sector, the treasury, and the central bank. Now, I defy anybody to do anything that quickly in any other program. And this is the scary bit. That has actually generated a system of differential equations, which are over here. So I didn't type a single equation in, but Ravel generated them for me automatically. And you don't have to look at the equations to know what's going on. You can understand by looking at the accounting structure, but it's also possible to add the capacity to model this by defining variables on the canvas and then making relationships between them. Now this is a very fast way of working out the structure of the financial system. And that is something anybody can do for themselves. And once you've got it there, let's take a look at some of the issues. Is the government paying interest? Yes, it is. How does it raise the interest? It raises it by creating the money, which is exactly the same way it finances a deficit. If spending exceeds taxation, then the Treasury goes into negative equity, and that creates an identical positive equity for the private sector over here. So spending by the government, and I've got, let's see, I've got tax, but I haven't got government spending. Oh yeah, government spending minus taxation increases the value of the private sector, and interest on bonds paid by the Treasury increases the net worth of the banking sector. And the key point to work out whether any borrowing of money is going on is borrowing of money has to reduce what's in here or here. Okay? If you're going to borrow money, then you're going to be taking something out of deposit accounts or bank accounts. Is the government doing that over there? No, it's doing everything on the asset side of the system. So the bond sales convert an asset which used to earn very little income, no income in fact, for the banks, into one that does earn income. And that's why they do the bond sales, the primary reason why they do it. And they get interest out of that, which increases the net worth out of which they can spend. So all this stuff, it's once you see the structure, you can't believe the conventional economic approach. So that, I'll stop sharing now, but that's one of the tools that I've invented to make it possible for people to play with it themselves. It'll take a while. It's going to be a bit intimidating the first time people try to do it. But once they do, they'll realize, hang on a second, it just isn't true. The government's not borrowing money, it's creating it. And then the question becomes, well, should the government be in negative equity? Well, the other side of that model I showed earlier is that negative equity for one entity means identical positive equity for the rest of this economy. So if the government's in negative equity, to say $43.6 trillion, for example, then it means the non-government sectors are in positive equity to $43.6 trillion. Somebody's asking for the platform that I just used there, by the way, and I'll just answer that in the chat. Actually, I'll bring it up on screen and show it on screen again. So pardon me, taking a bit of time here. So I'll share that. That's Ravelation, or Ravel as I call it. And we're now distributing Ravel through Patreon for $7 a month subscription. So I'll just actually quickly, I'll type it up and then bring it up on screen here. So let's just drag this up once it comes down. Okay. So that's the package. And if you want to get access to it, you can sign up for free and try it out for a while yourself. But it's either $1 a month for the, this is showing Australian because I'm Australian, pardon me. But it's either $7 a month as it happens in the US dollars to get the program straight away. And then there's a cheap version where you just get the modeling capability but not data analysis. And then there's one more, which is a free trial. So that's where you get it. And that's the, I'll put the link in the chat now so you can see it. So that's where that software is available. And I know that's been pretty rapid, but I hope that gives you a hand. It is possible to make this stuff accessible to people who aren't professionals and experts. And even if they can't drive it to the standard that a professional has to do, they can drive it to the stage where they can use it to discern who's making sense and who's not making sense when they're talking about money creation and government spending.
All right. Since I promised to make this a conversation rather than just you and me going back and forth, I'm just going to briefly respond and say that I'm not sure that what you just walked us through would convince an ordinary person that this stuff is accessible to them, that they are capable of
pretty quickly. Yeah.
of understanding this stuff and forming their own opinions. I'm not sure that it would convince them that the model of relying on experts is not the right one, and that they need to take seriously their own agency in forming economic consciousness and economic policy. But like I said, I want to make this a group discussion. So let's get to some of the people who have had their hands raised. I'm going to bring in Ed Dodson here.
Okay. Steve, I have to concur with what Josh just said to you. I have an accounting degree, and I was an accountant for a bank. I have tried to follow your analysis in other places, and it's technically pretty challenging. I try to teach political economics without math, I call it. And most people, I think the serious problem we have is with statistics and mathematics.
Yeah.
And so, but my question to you is more fundamental, because you referred to government issuance of money, and my conclusion is that we don't, other than minting coinage, it is the central bank that creates the money, which they then make available. Pardon me?
Yeah. So keep going. Yeah.
So which they then lend to the national government at interest. And so, why don't we just do what Stephanie Kelton and Randall Wray have suggested? Eliminate the Fed, the central banks, and give the Treasury the authorization to issue currency into spending through government agencies without debt.
Well, first of your analysis is wrong, I'm afraid to say.
Okay.
It's not the central. Okay. And that's why the accounting is necessary. Nobody in MMT has invented anything like Ravel. So I'm trying to get them to use it because it's the only tool that does integrated double entry bookkeeping tables in a very comprehensive way. So when you do that, and that's what I did very quickly, I'm happy to go through more slowly again at the end if you like. But when you look at what creates money, the answer is it's something which increases the liabilities or equity of the banking sector, because fundamentally money these days is a small amount as cash, and that is created by the central bank in most countries in the world. But a major amount of money is the value in deposit accounts of private individuals at the bank and the bank's own short-term equity. So, and then for double entry bookkeeping reasons, of course, if you have one entry on liabilities on equity, you've got to have another entry somewhere. Now, that other entry is also on the liabilities or equity side. That just shuffles existing money around. It doesn't create money. So for an operation to create money, it's got to occur both on the liabilities/equity side and the asset side. Now, if you take a look at that table, and I'll bring it up in a moment if you like, or we can talk about it later, the government spending increases deposit accounts and increases reserves. That's on both the assets and liabilities side at once. Taxation decreases deposits and decreases reserves. That's also on both sides. Interest payments increase reserves and increase bank equity. So all those operations are money creating or destroying operations. Operations which occur just on the asset side shuffle assets around. Operations just on the liabilities or equity side shuffle liabilities or equity around. So when you look at it like that, the Treasury is already creating the money. The central bank is a conduit for that. If the central bank didn't exist, then the government would need to bank with the private banks, and we would have the system in which the government doesn't create money. Okay? And I can model that as well. I can happily show that if you like now or later in the conversation. But the fundamental thing is the Treasury is the creator of money. Now, a central bank plays, I think, two essential roles. it fucks up on its third role, which is the main one it's got, but it plays two essential roles. One is it's the conduit for banks to have trade, do exchanges with themselves, the settlement process. And the reserves are more correctly called bank settlement accounts. So they're critical for having a multi-bank private banking system. You need to have a clearinghouse, and it could be done privately. That was actually JP Morgan used to do that in the 19th century. But fundamentally, that's, I think, better to be done by a public institution. So that's the clearinghouse role of the central bank. The central bank is also linked between the Treasury and private bank accounts. So when I say the government spends and puts money in deposit accounts, and that's also put into reserve accounts, of course, that's an incredibly complicated operation at the individual level. So you have a bank account, you pay tax, Josh pays tax, et cetera, et cetera. When the government allocates, it's allocating a huge database, which, like in the American case, if you're looking at annual taxation, it might have 180 million entries for the 180 million or so bank accounts that make up the financial structure of the United States. But what the government does is it transfers earmarked money from its consolidated revenue funds, plural, okay, to the reserve accounts, where that's earmarked for particular recipients like yourself in a, let's say you bank with Citibank, and then there'd be a account for Edward Dodson at Citibank of X amount of spending or taxation and so on. So the central bank plays that conduit role between the Treasury and the reserve. If you wanted to get rid of the central bank, that's just consolidate all government operations in one unit, then the Treasury would need to take over those functions. So I think it's better left where it is in terms of having
Really?
people more. Okay, but the thing which they stuff up completely is thinking they can control the rate of inflation using interest rates, and that's nonsense. And it's also because they're dominated by neoclassical economists, as is the Treasury, of course. But I think the dominance is worse in central banks. So I'd rather get rid of that function and say, okay, the interest rate setting should go back to the Treasury, and largely give up on the whole idea that you can control the rate of inflation using interest rates. So if I come back to the point about what does issuing bonds actually do, the main thing issuing bonds does is it means the central bank doesn't operate an overdraft account for the Treasury, because when you look at the bond sales, the two sources of incoming income in the aggregate to the consolidated revenue fund are taxation and bond sales. So if you don't have bond sales, because spending exceeds taxation and you're also paying interest on bonds, the consolidated revenue fund would necessarily go negative. Now with bond sales, it remains non-negative, positive or non-negative. So that's a sort of a preferable situation in one sense. It's very weird to have a bank whose main customer's got an enormous overdraft, even if it's the central bank. So I'm happy with the structure of.
One final question on this,
Yeah,
and then
sure.
I'll pass it on.
Yeah.
Should the central bank at all be holding bonds in its own portfolio, or should all bonds issued be sold to private individuals and private entities?
I'd be happy to have all the bonds sold to the central bank.
Really?
Okay, because that's fun. Like in a roundabout way, if the government runs a deficit of 2 trillion, and then has, say, outstanding interest payments of 1 trillion, then the Treasury will issue $3 trillion worth of bonds, which will be purchased by the private banks, because that converts $3 trillion of reserves into $3 trillion worth of income earning assets. So they'll do it happily. But then people complain, oh, the government's in debt, it's paying money. Well, why doesn't the central bank buy the fucking lot? Okay. Now, the central bank can do that. What we call QE is just an extreme version of open market operations that central banks do all the time. So it's quite feasible. But if you said, okay, if you lot are sick of the government being in debt, bugger it, the government's going to buy its own debt. The government central bank it puts $3 trillion into the reserve accounts of private banks, takes all the bonds onto its books. The government's no longer in debt. What are you complaining about? Now, of course, the complaints would start immediately, because bonds are a very nice income earner, thanks very much, for the private banks. And bonds are also the major trading entity on financial markets. So the people who complain most about the government abolishing government debt, which it could do overnight, would be the financial system. And yet the financial system is pushing this myth that the government borrows from it. So, I think enormous amount of confusion out of that. And the simplest way to get around the confusion is say, okay, the central bank is going to buy all bonds that are outstanding, period, or buy all the bonds back off the private financial institutions. And then you get a different form of complaint. Now, I very much enjoy being treasurer and doing that and waiting until the banks were coming to my door, pleading with me to sell some of the bonds back to them.
Well, my interest income would decline.
There you go. I know. There's lots of people in your situation. So it's people buy the bonds because it's a guaranteed income source. Okay. And you actually, in terms of how people adjust financial portfolios, you need what's seen as a safe asset. And the treasury bond is regarded as a safe asset. So it plays a lot of functional roles in the economy, but it also generates these crazy myths. And the easiest way to solve it is, all right, you're sick about government debt, it's gone. Next problem. I said, but where's our income stream? You want me to sell some bonds back to you, do you? Okay. So we need to re-educate people, and that would be a classic way to go about it. Won't happen, of course. That's why I can fantasize about it.
Much to think about. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you. But do check the accounting.
All right. I'm going to start to sound like a broken record here, but I think that it's an important point that needs to be reinforced, which is I'm still not sure that we're coming anywhere close to having what I think would be considered an accessible conversation to someone who is an educated adult, but doesn't have any specialized training in economics. And if we go back to the Gesell quote, which I started with, that's necessary. Maybe the conclusion that we're going to come to is that Gesell's quote, Gesell was wrong, that
I think he's got a good point, but the thing is, this isn't easy. Okay, it's not complicated, but it isn't easy. So one thing, I'm writing a post, I haven't had a chance to finish it yet, where I'm saying this is how you can build a model in Ravel and taking people through step by step, not as the intent to sell a copy of Ravel to 180 million Americans, or in the portion of the rest of the world. But if I could sell it to 1.8 million Americans and say, okay, now when your friends hammer you at the bar about how the government's in hock to us, sit them down and hit them over the head with this stuff. Become a campaigner, an acolyte in that sense, because if you get enough people in the audience who know how to do the accounting and they can talk to their friends, then you reduce the need to make it the lowest common denominator. You can get people who are committed and want to change attitudes. And my analogy here, and I'm writing this up in the blog post as well, is it's fundamentally that not everybody owns a telescope. Okay, but enough people know people who own telescopes. They can say, "Can I see craters on the moon?" And you can go and take a look at craters on the moon. You're, oh, in that case, the heavens aren't perfect, so Ptolemy must be wrong. And that's where we stand with monetary theory. We've got a theory of money dominating how we. Cam saying we just got beat up at the bar instead of listened to you. I can understand that being a danger. But most people don't operate a telescope. Okay, but most people have seen a telescope, have looked down it, and know what they see they can trust. And when they've just seen that, they can't fall for the flat Earth nonsense or that sort of thing, or the argument that the heavens are perfect, etc., etc. And I regard Ravel as the monetary telescope. So if a handful of people learn, relative handful, they can communicate it to the rest, and so long as they don't get beaten up at the pub, they have a chance of explaining the real world to these people and not letting them fall for the Ptolemaic myths of modern economics.
All right, let's bring in another raised hand here. W.E. Perry, if you'd like to join the screen, you'll need to turn your camera on. If not, you can just go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Josh. I'm going to stay invisible, as it were. Steve, it's Walter Perry. Great little widget you've got there. For whatever reason, my mind may be as peculiar as yours, but I find this totally intuitive. The suggestion I would make to you, and I'm actually willing to code it up for you if you'd like, is that instead of double entry accounting, you move to triple entry accounting, where it's driven off the journal rather than off the balance sheet. I mean, you work directly in the balance sheet with your tools, but if you work off the journal, that has the advantage of counterparties' shared journal entries. Therefore, it need not matter when you reconcile your books with a counterparty's books, uh, how they've booked it in their own double entry system, because you share the transactions on the journal and therefore can reconcile over the transactions. But I raised my hand originally on your first point. Again, you're absolutely right. The only thing I would take great exception to is what gives governments the gall to create non-competitive. I'm not going to call it money. We're talking about the creation of credit here. I mean, there really is no useful thing described by the term money when what we're talking about here is credit. But the most perverse thing that governments do at present is try and enforce their monopoly on credit creation, which is to say credit settlement in their own denominated currencies. And they do it with guns, and they do it with the sanctions regime. And it delegitimizes something that is a perfectly fine, open, free market operation, unless you shoot your competitors. I mean, why shouldn't the government's settlement system, the Fed buyer, compete with Bitcoin's settlement system?
You live in a country, and a large part of it, how a country defines its borders, is where its money is accepted. And if you, what you're saying is we shouldn't have fiat money. Fundamentally, that's what I'm reading you as saying. The government shouldn't create money.
Yeah, except I don't think the term money serves any useful semantic end.
So you're saying if you use the word credit, I'm happy to use the word credit. I think you're wrong, but I'm happy to use the same word.
Or
So
we can use the word settlement, because what
Okay.
we're really talking about is the clearing of trades and their finality and settlement.
Yeah. If you don't, this is why double entry bookkeeping does matter. Maybe I could use journals as you're suggesting, but there's another point that matters here as well, and that is that in the aggregate, the sum of all financial assets and liabilities is zero. Okay. Physical assets, which are non-financial assets, are a different story. The sum total of non-financial assets is greater than zero, but financial assets are necessarily zero. Now, if you say the government shouldn't be involved in that, and that's pretty much what you're saying,
No,
then
I'm saying that they should not give themselves by fiat authority a monopoly.
well, what you're saying, they should operate like a private bank. Okay, is that what
Exactly.
you're saying? I think you're wrong, totally wrong, and I want to tell you why. And that is that if they operate as a private bank, that means the non-bank economy, the non-bank financial, the non-bank section of the economy, individuals and companies making real things, they're necessarily in negative equity. If the only thing we have facing us is we have a private sector, a non-bank private sector, and a banking sector, whether that's private or mixed, as you're suggesting here, because banks have to be in positive equity, positive financial equity, necessarily the rest of the economy is in identical negative equity. Now, one of the great reasons in favor of the government, and they say if you're in negative equity, I mean, I've been in that situation myself. Okay, my financial liability has been greater than financial assets. It doesn't make you feel comfortable. You panic about it. You don't have a way of covering it because you're not a government. Therefore, you find, what do? I know, I'll borrow money from a bank and I'll go gamble on the price of non-financial assets like houses or shares. And if they go up in value, my sum will be positive. Whoopie-doo. Why do you
Well,
get involved in
there's a completely different path out of that. I mean,
you tell me it, but I think you're totally wrong. So tell me what your path is, but I think
all
you're
right,
completely wrong.
in the model you put up there, it's the Treasury, which is in negative equity.
Yep, that's
And
right.
right, I'm saying that every self-sovereign individual can and should be able to replicate that same position.
In
And
negative equity.
absolutely, on the
So you're
same
saying
basis,
everybody should be able to be in negative equity.
they should, I mean, it's a nominal negative equity, same as it is with the Treasury. The Treasury will issue bonds. The individual will issue his own notes, his own IOUs, which will be treated by a hybrid and diverse market as they deserve to be treated in an open market.
And people will intelligently choose the conservative one rather than choosing ones that are doing radical amounts of interest payments, and nobody will get caught up in Ponzi. I'm sorry, I've heard all this stuff before. I regard it as nonsense. Okay,
Why?
that was tried.
Why?
That was tried in 19th century America. Tried in
No,
19th
it
century
wasn't.
Australia.
It wasn't
There were
actually.
private banks. There were private banks.
I understand completely both the Wildcat history and the history of discount on bankers' acceptances and letters of
Yeah.
credit, which characterized the settlement system of the 19th century. Nonetheless, in an informed economy, and your model requires an informed economy, just
No, it
as
doesn't. It
mine
requires
does.
ordinary people today. It's describing the ordinary. Somebody say, Peter Frankel, there's 10,000 different currencies in the United States. I mean, sorry, I want to talk to other people here because I completely disagree with your perspective. I think you're wrong about it. It's giving like an idealized Austrian idea of how the system could operate with informed people, yada, yada, yada. It's as if people wouldn't be seduced by high rates of interest. They were. They gave their money. So that's why bloody Ponzi, we call Ponzi
why,
Ponzi.
by
Sorry, I'm
what
going to finish here.
authority,
You,
on what authority do you presume to prescribe the behavior of so-called ordinary people?
I'm telling you what
This
they
is what
fucking
you're
did.
discussing is an exercise in social engineering.
It's not so. You're talking social engineering. You're talking about changing the entire structure of the financial system to bring in what you see as an ideal. I'm saying this is the
I'm
current
talking
structure.
about changing it bottom up by those who are willing to compete in an open
Well,
market
okay,
rather
well,
than changing it top down.
go and build a society in Patagonia and tell us how it works out. I'm sorry, I think you're making a completely ludicrous case. I've heard it plenty of times. You can see why I'm not particularly surprised by your views, but I'm not interested in them either. I think you've got a completely wrong picture of how the system operates now and how that system would operate. And my best example there is Charles Ponzi. Charles Ponzi had people putting money to his bank because he was promising 45% return over 6 months. Okay, large parts of Boston, the most sophisticated financial city in the world at the time, poured their money into Ponzi's bank for these incredible returns, and nobody was asking where the money was coming from. He finally went totally belly up. Okay, now that was if what you're saying was feasible with ordinary people that you think have got this capacity to distinguish good money from bad money, Ponzi wouldn't have happened. He did.
And by what authority do you presume to regulate what
I'm not
people
presuming,
do
I'm
of their own
describing
free
how the
will?
bloody system works. You're the one with you're saying, follow my model. You're saying, let's do it
No,
this
I'm
way.
not
I'm
saying
saying,
follow my model. I'm saying allow 1,000 flowers to bloom.
yeah, that worked pretty well in China too. And I'm a fan of China, but not a fan of mouths with 1,000 flowers. I'm sorry, I think it's a total fantasy. And if you did it, there'd be enormous discount rates between different forms of money. Uh, there'd be the wildcat banks would come back again.
You're
You know why
just
they're called the
wildly
wildcat bank?
speculating.
So are you, for Christ's sake. Come on.
No, I'm
You tell
not.
me you're not
No,
wildly
I'm not.
speculating?
Oh,
Huh?
what
You're
have
not
I said?
speculating.
What have
You're
I
not speculating
said
the
that
system
is
might work.
semantically speculative in the slightest?
Well, I think you've got a very bad idea of what speculation amounts to, because all I've heard from you is speculation about a non-existent system that you
Well,
think would be
in
better than our system.
the semantic proof, speculation is essentially religion. It is that which is enforced by narrative.
I want to
And
talk to somebody. I'm sorry, we've given you a large amount of time here. Let's have somebody else come into the conversation. Josh.
All right. Steve, I'm curious, and this will actually, it relates to what you were just talking about, and it also relates to what we will be talking about in our next episode with guest Tim Jenkin, who I notice has joined us today. I'm sure you're familiar with the Let's model for alternative exchange. In my mind, if I'm understanding correctly, that would be an example of allowing individuals to go into negative equity. What is your take on the Let's model?
I think I'm no critic of Let's. I mean, I was a critic of that particular person's arguments a moment ago because he wants to make the entire financial system operate that way. But Let's, because we have a credit system which has got all the flaws of the current system, the credit system will break down, and when it breaks down, that means transactions collapse. So Let schemes and schemes like it often evolved out of tradesmen finding they weren't getting work and weren't getting paid, and then they put these ideas a way of getting work. And it's very much like the Gesell scheme in that sense, the Wargle experiment. People create a local currency which circulates locally or circulates through a region when you have a Let's type scheme. And that's fine. I'm quite happy with those. But they're not trying to make like that means you've still got a dollar bill. You've got a few little systems like Let's, all of which transfer into the domestic currency in some manner or other. So you value, your Let's often used to value time at $10 an hour. So one Let was 1 hour's worth of labor, whether you were a worker, a construction worker or a doctor. And that's sort of, valuing people on their labor time as well, which I think is quite a reasonable way to value time and effort in a capitalist economy. It's a potentially good system. So I like them because the credit system is run by banks which can be quite rapacious about who they lend to, and you get Ponzi schemes coming all the time out of the sort of lending private banks will do right now. And they're regulated by people in central banks that haven't got a clue about money to begin with, let alone the different monetary systems. So we've got a total dog's breakfast of a formal financial system. And in that case, things like Let's give you a workable alternative that adjusts for some of the deficiencies of the credit system. So I'm happy with the idea of Let's, but not happy with the idea of 1,000 currencies.
All right, let's go to the next question, which is Cam. Let me bring him into the screen. Cam, go ahead.
Hello, I've been itching to ask this question since I finished the Gesell Foundation's YouTube course, and something that sort of jumped out to me in the weeks following as I was considering it is there's sort of maybe 2 videos missing from that lecture series because they're missing from perhaps Gesell's own experience of the world, which is both Georgism and Gesell's thought have a lot of prescriptions on what to do with land, how to organize land for the betterment of all. But then in the modern world, maybe at his time, 19 out of 20 people were involved in agriculture. Now it's 1 or 2 out of 20, and the rest are involved in a more complicated trade in the economy. What's loose in this global economy that's totally unaccounted for, and I would love to ask Gesell if he was here, is what do we do about resources like commodities that are discovered? The oil and gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean are worth $524 billion, and it's actually kind of a curse to some of the people who live nearby. Same thing with the oil basins underneath the Tarim Basin in China that represent 80% of China's oil wealth. Well, the people that lived above that.
Oh, you've dropped out. Sorry. Cam, your voice went for a second there. Can you try again?
Yes. Interesting. Yeah, I just saw a notification on that. So basically, the Uyghurs are in some ways perhaps entitled to some portion of that, but instead it's a curse. They're being swallowed by it. And the same story goes on repeat everywhere, where something is discovered and it triggers a larger national process. I mean, I would love to see Silvio Gesell in another world go to Turkmenistan in 2015 and try to recreate the world miracle there. I think there's just something missing, and it's not that perhaps he never got a chance for the question to be asked to him. So I'd love to ask you two and anybody else, what do you think we can do about this?
Yeah, I think that's quite a reasonable proposition because my overall analysis of economics goes back to saying that what we call GDP is fundamentally energy transformed into useful forms for humans. And without this exploitation of free energy, we wouldn't exist as a species, let alone as a civilization. And the fact that we've been able to go energy consumption, standard of living so far above the ordinary other mammals is because we're exploiting this free energy. So that's absolutely the fundamental foundation of economic wealth, and with enormous consequences flow from that. One of course, as you're mentioning here, is that individuals living above a resource don't necessarily benefit. In fact, they can suffer from that resource. On that front, I love the movie Avatar, the first one, not the second, because it shows exactly that situation. Their world was destroyed by people trying to get that resource. So yeah, it's absolutely critical that we understand the role of energy and the need for resources and the fact that they can occur anywhere on the planet. So the fundamental idea would be to say that those should be resources owned in common in some sense, and probably with a special dispensation for those who live above them. Because if we're going to exploit those resources, we have to disturb where they live on the planet, more so than we disturb anywhere else. So there are immense issues about ownership of resources and compensation for people from whose land they're taken, and limits on how much we use of those resources, because the ecological crisis we face right now is because we don't have any, recompense for the pollution we put into the atmosphere. I hear a lot of people say carbon dioxide isn't a big thing. I hope there aren't many climate change deniers on this particular call. But one of the interesting factoids is that the mass of carbon dioxide, actually the mass of carbon alone that we're put into the atmosphere, is greater than the mass of all objects ever created by humanity. So we put a huge burden on the ecology of the planet. And I think both George and Gesell need some updating for the world in which we live, which, to quote, I've forgotten his name all of a sudden, but one of the few decent American economists, William Baumol, said we've gone from what he called a cowboy economy to a spaceship economy. And what you allow in a spaceship is very different to what you allow a cowboy to do.
If I could
That help as an
respond,
answer? Yeah.
if I could respond sort of on behalf of Gesell to the extent that I'm capable of doing that. I'm not sure that I understand the problem that you see in terms of the utilization of natural resources in a Gesellian system. Let's imagine, for example, that we are living in a Gesellian system, and individual A has a lease on a piece of agricultural land for which he's paying $1,000 a month. That means that for agricultural use, nobody else thought that piece of land was worth paying more than $1,000 a month for. Now, let's say that all of a sudden oil or gold or lithium is discovered under the ground. That will mean that now there are going to be all sorts of people who are happy to pay $1,000, $10,000, $100,000 a month for that same piece of land, in order to have the exclusive opportunity to exploit the resources that are now known to exist there. And that competitive bidding for that lease, at least as I understand it, would result in, if not all, at least a very large portion of the value of the resources, which I think we all agree should be thought of as the common property of society, going into the public treasury, because it's not just going to be one outfit that is willing and able to pay $10,000, $100,000, $1 million a month to exploit that opportunity. There's going to be many of them, and the competition between them is going to drive the lease rate up so far that that some, if not all, of the wealth that is being extracted will flow into the public treasury rather than into private pockets.
So in that model, the sort of the activation energy of capturing this resource and all the risk associated with that comes from a private enterprise. What happens in the future when that lease expires, or there's a maybe even we're talking about the oil is tapped, it's done producing, but now there's the ecological downsides. Are we sort of just pushing all that as like a anti-commons that the government will handle on the flip side?
No, that's a great point. It's and it's a point that I don't have a good answer for
Yeah, it's
from a
tough.
Gessellian perspective. I think that that is the number one um, objection that I'm aware of to the Gessellian proposal that concerns me. I don't know the answer to it. Steve, I'd be interested if you have any thoughts on.
Just elaborate again, because I missed part of that. I was looking part of the comments instead. So Cam, again?
The question was along the lines of, let's say, the process of extracting this resource is finished, and just like in even my home state, there's 1,400 abandoned mines that are now the problem of the state to try to address. What do we do in a either Giselian or Georgist model of how to handle resources with the tail end of it, the
This
damage?
is one thing. This is one that actually, again, it's a very good question that I haven't got an answer for either in toto. But the basic point is that we're suffering from the laws of thermodynamics here. And if you want to use energy, you necessarily generate waste. And like with those people who don't know the laws of thermodynamics, there's the first law which says there's conservation of energy. So energy is neither created nor destroyed. You change its form, but you don't create additional energy. The second law is known the law of entropy, and that is that if you use energy to do waste, then order degenerates over time. So necessarily trying to perform work using energy will generate waste. And that's basically meaning energy goes from high frequency to low frequency where you can no longer exploit it. So you've got necessarily a waste generation, but that also turns up with physical resources as well. If you want to use copper, you've got to create copper tailings. And the waste in copper tailings actually far exceeds the amount of actual copper we get out of that. If you actually try to go and then set up to say that any company that exploits that must regenerate the soil to what it was like beforehand, pay the actual costs, I don't know that you get a profit from anything. Quite possibly, profit would not exist. Okay?
It's
And that gives
possible,
you
yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, when I think about it, if you tried to say that the cost of production must include the cost of remediation of the land you've damaged in the process, restore it to its pristine state, and still make a profit, even if it was technically possible, I think it's highly unlikely to happen most of the time. So if you actually, partially in that sense, we've got to generate the waste to be and ignore it to be able to have a profit-based economy. Once we get, if we ever get into outer space and do it in outer space, that doesn't matter. You eject, your waste gets chucked into the local star system, local star, whatever that might be. But while we're doing it on this planet, then you necessarily degrade the biosphere in which we live, and that becomes ultimately fatal not just to us but to all living things. So, but again, if you try to take it all into account on this biosphere, then I think you'd find the second law of thermodynamics wins, and no profit is possible.
And then it starts to feel like every time a project like this is undertaken, it's given a implicit budget of Earth to spend to make its
Yeah.
profits.
Well, this is one reason that I think money has to become multidimensional at some stage. I mean, we're still talking. Even Gesell's idea is one-dimensional. There's one form of money, and it degrades over time. That's the only difference. Otherwise, money we have now exists permanently. Um, so it's still a one-dimensional definition. But if you had like money, including what you're doing to Earth's biosphere, positive or negative, then most of it's going to be negative. And so balancing the positive increase in money from profit of selling a commodity, you've also got the negative coming out of damaging the biosphere, and you were required to balance that. Again, because we're on the single biosphere, I think the answer would be you end up with a negative. So there's a way in which there's a thing in humans to actually strive for some sort of perfect system. Yeah, that's why I had the argument with the previous gentleman. Believing that was a perfect system. I don't think perfection is possible on this planet. So maybe sometimes we're going to have a half-baked system. We should be paying for the costs of remediating damage to land, but we don't do it. It's a tough one. I think a large part of it has to come out of changing how we think about ourselves on this planet, and rather than seeing ourselves as being, the boss and running nature, if we're truly the intelligent species, our goal should be to sustain life, and that's why we should be servants of life rather than exploiters of it. And that then would mean that you would have limits on how much you'd be willing to allow people to exploit of physical resources, because it has to be done in such a way that enhances the possibility of life continuing rather than destroying it, which is what we're doing right now. But as for whether we can get a monetary system, I really don't think we can.
Yeah, but there's always small steps, maybe a
Yeah,
1,000 years
yeah,
of extra civilization doesn't mean much geologically, but to the people that live for that 1,000 years, it probably meant something.
it does indeed. Yeah. Um, but yeah, I would rather find ourselves redefining society so society focuses upon supporting life first and foremost. That becomes, the prime objective becomes do not destroy life, or the capacity for life and evolution. And we're doing both right now. So that's obviously a major fault of our current society. And if we are to have a future sustainable society, then we cannot allow that to happen again. But how you do it, whether you could do it through a monetary system or you have to have prohibitions, I've got a feeling you're going to need prohibitions.
Yeah. It's an open question. I didn't expect an answer. I was hoping for a
It's
discussion
a
and I
good
got
question.
one.
I'm glad you asked it, and maybe gave us a chance to put us on the spot and try to answer it. But it's an important question. It's one that people after me will have to answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Steve, before we move on to the next question, you just said something that I'd like to probe a little bit more, which is you said Gesell's monetary proposal is one-dimensional, and that what is needed is multidimensional money. Can you expand on that statement and give some concrete form to what you meant by that?
Well, basically, it would be like money at the moment. If you sell something, then you make a profit out of whatever you've sold. Okay, and that's the major motivation for the evolution of capitalism over time, is the scale of those profits and the wealth it can accumulate. But to do that, you've necessarily got to do damage to the physical environment. So if you, for example, you can imagine like I'm a fan of what Musk is trying to do with rockets, for example. But of course, the rockets, and with both the carbon dioxide they're pumping out and the potential damage to the local area, that would be seen as a negative on the environment. So you have to have as well as getting positive entries on the money, to be negative entries on the other. And you might have controls about how negative you can be allowed to be before you can no longer continue the one that's giving you the profitable exchanges. Biodiversity. And so is another possibility. So you can imagine a whole range of potential ways to gain wealth. You can have somebody who's actually trying to regenerate and trying to expand biodiversity. They might be losing money in the process, but they're getting powerful positive credits on the other. And you need some sort of conversion system between those. So you convert some of your credits for biodiversity improvement into credits for money, for example, or vice versa. One little scheme that I've come up with, it was beaten to it by another guy who's become a colleague since then, uh, uh, Hardy, his first name, is the idea of tradable carbon credits. So you would have, to try to control carbon dioxide pollution, one thing we could do is have a parallel currency where the government issues carbon credits to everybody in the society at an equal per capita basis. And then when you buy something, you've got to pay two prices, the money price and the carbon price. Now, if you gave everybody the average, because we have such a skewed distribution of income, at least 95% of the population would not exhaust their carbon credits. But the top 5% would definitely exhaust their carbon credits, and they therefore need to buy them off the bottom 95%. So what you get out of that is a redistribution system, which would dramatically encourage a reduction in carbon-based uh, production, product manufacturing, and be an income redistribution from the rich to the poor. So that's one potential scheme. And that's, like, to me, it's a model of what could be done in the future. And the idea is that there'd be different. Like we can get credits for biodiversity. We can get credits for carbon dioxide, all of which are based on the damage we're doing. But then people who are doing that damage would run out of those credits themselves and have to buy credits off other people. And that would then encourage them not to do as much damage, and would also redistribute from the wealthy to the poor. So a range of ideas like that might give us a multidimensional form of money.
Fascinating. I've never considered such a thing, but I like the sound of it. All right, let's
I'll put that proposal up. I'll just type it in now. That's called EcoCore. Core.org, if anybody wants to check that out.
all right. Anthony Gill is our next question. Anthony, do you want to join the screen? If so, turn on your camera. If not, just unmute your mic and go ahead.
Thanks, Steve, for that great explanation of the balance sheets in banking and so on. I'm trying to draw a line between Silvio Gesell and Henry George and how best to convince people of it. And I've come up with, well, first of all, I'm going to talk about the Australian experience here. And I don't know whether you can see this chart well or not.
You got to get a better focus. Bring it back. It's totally unfocused right now. Move it in and out a bit. We'll see if it gets focused. Can we right close to the camera? I'm sorry, it's a white sheet with grey markings on it. We can't read it. Put it at the level of your face. No, still can't read it.
I wonder if it's because I've got the black back.
Turn
Yeah.
off blurring.
You need to
turn off.
unblur. You need to unblur.
Get rid of the blur. Yeah.
How do I do that? Which menu do I find that on?
Go to your video and uncheck it.
Turn off your background.
There is a little arrow next to the video on the bottom of the Zoom panel.
Got it. Okay.
Good.
Got it. Can you see this?
Okay. I'll make it full screen so I can read it more easily. Let's see if I pin your tweet there. Inflation showing land and money problem. ABS, RBA. Yes. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Okay. Now this is the Australian situation. So on the bottom line, we've got a timeline from 1990 through to the present. On the vertical axis, we've got some big numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Then you'll see three lines here. Now I'll tell you what they are. They're GDP growth, their wages growth, and their CPI growth.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got two lines going up here. One is land value, and on land value, these big numbers turn into billions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
All the rest are indexes. And the other one, tracking up with land value, is the money supply, M3 money supply in Australia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at Henry George, he said there's a land problem. Mm. If you look at Silvio Gesell, he said there's a money problem.
Mm.
And of course, the land and the money are growing exponentially, and all the rest of the inflation measures flatlining or just growing linearly. Now, if this two-speed economy continues in this projected manner, we will have more and more social problems. Yeah. So I thought, all right, well, let's have a look at land and money and come up with some solutions. Mm. Okay, so there are two problems. Money has two solutions. One, introduce a complementary currency, as you were talking about the Let's program, a currency that would not pay or receive interest, a currency that depreciates over time. And like you said, I base this currency on 1 hour of unskilled labour. It has a certain inflation resistance to it. So that's the first solution for the money problem. The second solution to the money problem is to put it in the hands of the people through a universal basic income. Mm.
Yep.
Okay, going to the land problem. Land and taxation are housemates. So we have a problem with the land going up. We need to fix that with taxation. And that's where Henry George comes in with land value tax. And when I say land, for the last Mick or Michael, it does include natural resources. Okay, and then the second one are banking reforms to fix the land problem, because at the intersection of land and money, you know, you've got the banks. And what you were talking about with your rabble,
Urban currency. Yeah.
the guts of it is, whether you look at it's government that's spending or whatever, or borrowing first, governments do spend first. But later on, as you said, they back it up with bond sales. And you mentioned something interesting. You said by law. By law, they have to do that. I'm not sure whether you're referring to the Australian situation or the American situation, but it just shows how tightly that is wrapped up for the bank's advantage. Because if the government has to buy bonds by law, and you just said that bonds are welfare for banks, it shows how entrenched our banking system is. So any reforms to make things better are going to have to diminish the banks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, my father was a banker in the 50s and 60s, 70s, and Dad worked for the Commonwealth Bank. I'm Australian, as you know, and he was actually offered a position at the Reserve Bank, but he turned it down because he enjoyed, strangely enough, dealing with people. But Dad was on the settlement. He was the settlement person on the Commonwealth Bank, for the Commonwealth Bank, on the daily settlement process for all the banks through the RBA. And you know, he was regarded as the brightest bloke there. So I'm well aware of the power of the banks. And Dad, who was never politically radical, in fact, he was quite conservative, used to say that in the 1950s, if the governor of the RBA told the private banks to go jump out a window, they'd ask which floor. He said 20 years later, they were telling the governor which floor to jump out of. So the power turned around, and the power turns around out of the rising level of private debt. And actually, just to share my screen, just to elaborate some of the points you were making there, which I agree with. When I try to find what's the causal process of rising house prices, it came to be accelerating levels of private debt. So this is similar to your first chart showing land value and money supply. This is household debt versus the household price index. Well, obviously graphed on opposing axes there. And you can see how debt rose dramatically, but has then been falling. Well, house prices rise and fall a bit at the same time. How do you find a link between the two? And it turned out, and I explained this in a book I haven't yet published, but I'll give people a link to it if I can later. It's on my Patreon site and my Substack site, is that what supplies the monetary demand for housing is new mortgage debt. And if you want to convert that into demand for new houses, you divide by the price level for houses, and you've got how many houses can be purchased, and that gives you the price level. If you differentiate that, the rate of change of the price level is related to the rate of acceleration of mortgage debt. And what I've got down here in this bottom graph, the colors are pretty yucky, but you get the basic idea. One is change in house prices, which is the purple line, and the other is change in the level of new mortgages, which is the orange line. And now they're both moving in the same direction. So what's actually going on is what drives rising house prices is accelerating mortgage debt, not just rising, but accelerating. And that's dangerous. We shouldn't allow that sort of thing. So we have to control the banks. We have to control what they can do, because fundamentally banks exist because we agree to let people create money. We don't know if that's what we're doing, but that's what we're doing. We allow them to create money, and we don't. It's a social power. It should be socially controlled. You can create money if you create it for good stuff. Okay, you know, firms producing new technologies, working capital, large consumption items. You produce it for Ponzi schemes and drug cartels, get the fuck out of here. So we need to have more controls over what banks do. We need to reverse that power. And one of the posts of mine that had the most effect on raising my profile internationally was a post I called "The Roving Cavaliers of Credit," and it was a quote from Marx, and he talked about the way this happened in the 19th century. He said this bunch of occasionally commercial situations let this bunch of parasites take over control of the physical production system. And this gang knows nothing about production and should have nothing to do with it. Spot on, Carl.
You're exactly right when you said money is created when banks lend, because this increase in the money supply is simply the bank
it's all
lending
gone. Yeah,
to houses.
yeah.
And
Well, it's all my government money creation, all bank money creation these days. This is another reason I was critical of our previous person I jumped on, is that most of it goes into asset speculation. They don't finance real stuff; they finance gambling, and gambling is very profitable until the gambler goes bankrupt.
Right. So the next question that I have is, how do we get the people, because to make change of this magnitude, it has to come from outside the system.
Yeah.
And most people are outside the system because it is the system itself that needs to be changed. And so it's very hard to be in the system and make those changes, the big structural changes that are necessary. This is the challenge.
I'm a complete cynic on our capacity to make those sorts of decisions. We've dumbed ourselves down over the last 40 years quite dramatically. And I don't think we're going to do it in a sensible fashion. I think what's going to happen instead is an ecological crisis that will be challenging for the continued existence of civilization, if not the species itself. And in those circumstances, the survivors of that process are going to have to build something more sustainable. And we will be a cautionary tale as to what happens if you don't. So ideally, what I'd like to do is have people learn how it works and then change the system and get away from it. But I simply can't see it happening. We're too close to the precipice. We're going to go over the edge, and it's then a question of what happens. Whether enough of us survive the fall to recreate a society which could ultimately become self-sustaining, and we'd be the cautionary tale of what happens if you don't do that.
I fear that you are probably correct. And just before we started this meeting, I said to Josh, because I too have got to that point, and we're going to have to kind of start again. I said to Josh, this is why we need one of your governance models, because it's all going to end in tears.
It is.
I'm trying to change things along, but I don't think I'm going to be successful, as you just outlined.
I'm the same. So like a lot of what I'm doing now is trying to give people tools to understand what the fuck happened after the fuck has happened. And this is just slightly before the fuck. It's, it's tragic. I mean, it's incredibly tragic. This is our situation. Like in my own circumstances, I never expected to be spending my time expecting the collapse of civilization before I die. And trying to prevent that collapse being, it's too late to prevent it. The question is, how do you enable something to be salvaged from it? And that's another situation I find myself in. And so far, I've been completely unsuccessful. The people I'm having impact on aren't the ones who make the decisions. And like in terms of Josh's previous questions about getting everybody committed to something, the majority have been fooled by the climate change trivializers, the fossil fuel companies, the mainstream economists as well. So, our chances of success are pretty close to zero, and the consequences of it not succeeding are pretty close to 100% destruction of civilization.
And you're not the first one who understands what's happening to draw that existential conclusion.
There are some others, like people like Leon Simons. It's in climate, mostly climate change scientists, people like Peter Kalmus, Jim Lenton, these are people I deal with personally, fairly regularly. And like they are all becoming incredibly despondent, think, what the fuck do we do? Do we keep on trying to change direction, or we go off and enjoy what's left of our lives and try to reserve our families? All these horrible conversations are happening amongst people who are really highly informed about these issues. And you watch the majority have no idea. And we are so close. So, it's not a cheery situation to find myself in.
If we're going to talk timelines, in Australia, we have a federal election next year, 2025. And then we usually have them every 3 years. The following one will be 2028. And in my view, that's the crunch time, because a lot of people are pointing to some bad things happening towards the end of the decade. And that election, 2028, will kind of be in that time zone window. And unless we can affect big change in that election, we may as well just pack up and go and enjoy the rest of our lives.
Yeah, I
That's
think
my
Australia is one of the few potential survival places, but it won't necessarily be comfortable. And they're not prepared for it. They don't have the manufacturing capability. They're far too reliant upon fossil fuels already. So yeah, there's, even countries that are going to survive are going to have a very hard time about it. But let's let somebody else. Good to talk with you there, but let's let some others in, Anthony, and keep on going.
Steve, if before we bring in Joe, who's next, if you just had to put a number on it, in your estimation, what percentage of humanity will survive the disaster scenario that you see headed our way?
I think it'd be amazing success if 10% survived.
Okay. If that's the case, I want to just briefly refer back to that somewhat contentious exchange that you had with Mr. Perry, because I'm on very much the same page as you and Anthony, in terms of not thinking it very likely that we're going to find the solutions that would be necessary to keep the wheels from falling off the bus and killing a lot of us. Something that Mr. Perry said was, or argued for, was let 1,000 flowers bloom. I forgot exactly how he put it.
Yeah, use that phrase.
And that is actually something that is on my mind. I mentioned to you when we spoke privately in advance of this meeting that I've become a father recently, and that has, very much changed my priorities and my thinking about these issues. Used to be of a mindset of, well, I'm just gonna try to protect myself and hope that I'm gone by the time the worst of this happens. Now, as a father, I can't really look at it that way anymore. So my thinking has gone in the direction of, creating new community and economy from the ground up in the right parts of the world, perhaps Australia, perhaps parts of South America, and really trying to rebuild from the ground up. That would be an example of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, would it not? And if you think that, that 10% of us are going to make it through, then why wouldn't it make sense to take the 1,000 flowers approach?
Look, the 1,000 flowers presume the continued existence of the nation. This ain't going to be flowers. I mean, my basic picture is that Mad Max is the most prophetic movie ever made. Okay, except that Mad Max was actually probably preferable what we're going to get, which is more going to be like the Ukrainian Holodomor, where large numbers of people die of starvation, and there's just no Blade Runner for it. That'd be Peter. Blade Runner would be an absolute. It'd be heaven compared to what we're going to go through, I think. So in that situation, we are going to need, Mad Max with way worse dental hygiene, says Cam. And underarm for that matter. Government tyranny, agreed. Yes, it was. Okay. This is going to be created by not governing, okay, by letting the free market rip and believing we can do it indefinitely. So you're going to have this will be the private version of the public Holodomor back from the 1930s. But yeah, it's a breakdown of civilization is extremely likely. The only societies that I think are going to have a chance of surviving are ones which are socially cohesive to begin with, and that's places like China, which has a strong sense of social cohesion to it, which involves some tyranny as well, but also the Chinese people have benefited dramatically from their government in the last 40 years. So there's extent to which the trust that the Chinese have in their government reflects what their government's achieved. Maybe China will hold together. I think its problem is it's too damn big. But something of that scale, that is, the thought that a society of that scale can survive what we're going to go through is to me unlikely, because what we're seeing already is a dramatic increase in the volatility of the weather systems, and like the most dangerous tipping point we face is the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which was regarded just 15 years ago as something that might take 3 to 5 degrees of warming and would take centuries to impact on us. And the most recent research said it's been between 1.1 and 3.8 will trigger it. We're already at 1.5. And that it could operate rapidly enough to dramatically reduce the habitability of Europe within 30 years of whenever it triggers. Now, the earliest estimates are that it will start triggering next year, 2025, and the probability ranges I've seen from a range of science papers on this topic give the probability of it breaking down before 2050 of anything from 60 to 90% chance. Now, once that happens, the extremes that causes of temperature change on the planet are ridiculous. The average temperature of the northern hemisphere could fall by 20 degrees. The average temperature of the southern would raise by 20 degrees. That means neither side is inhabitable. You get an albedo effect coming out of it, as well as Peter mentions here, that's in the chat, that as the ice sheets advance because of the collapse of the AMOC, that'll partially reduce the temperature rise caused by the trapping of carbon dioxide. So it's going to be an exciting, time when this starts happening. But the fact we're even talking about issues like that is scary as hell. And with that increase in volatility of temperature, as well as the absolute level, the possibility of maintaining a sedentary civilization, rapidly heads towards zero. So I've got a feeling that the most survivable societies on the planet are going to be nomadic. And I mean either nomadic or in a hunter and gatherers in a region where they won't be too badly affected. My favorite nomination for a civilization that is likely to survive this is New Guinea highlands. They're already hunter gatherers. They live in 200 or 300 very well separated valleys, high altitude, and the rainfall there won't change too dramatically compared to the rest of the world. So, that's the level of collapse of knowledge that I see us going through is extreme. And my one, the greatest fear I have is, everything we've learned in the last 250 years, basically the fossil fuel era, will be lost by the destruction caused afterwards. And we'll go back to a level of ignorance that's comparable to the pre-Galilean world. So that's the scariest prospect I think we face. And I'm too old to see it all act through. I don't want to live through some of what I expect to happen. But I think I'll see the start of it before I die.
All right, that's inspiring. Joe, you had your hand up. And now it's no longer up. Did you want to?
No, I would like to make an observation and ask a question. But I think after that last commentary, I may be better to call my therapist. In terms of an observation, Steve I think it's important to kind of take a step back and see what Steve's doing. He's providing us with the tools that allow us to mobilize ourselves so this does not have to happen. Keynes said anything we can actually do, we can afford. And Steve has actually described in his presentation how we can afford to mobilize our resources and address this thing properly. My question, Steve, by the way, you mentioned China, and China, I would say China has done a lot of what Steve says, not with the same priorities, but they've been mobilizing themselves for all those years and mobilizing resources to get a lot more out of them than we have out of ours. And there's been, we've focused on austerity, they focus on mobilizing resources. And it's been quite Keynesian. There's a fellow by the name of Frank Newman who was deputy Minister of Treasury or whatever is United States they call it, and he was also the CFO for Wells Fargo and maybe the Bank of America. So he is a uber banker in terms of his knowledge, and he titled his book "Six Myths that we shouldn't practice and what we can learn from China." And I think Steve, in his own way, has been doing the same thing. Anyway, my question for Steve is, I've noticed in Positive Money that he is an advisor, and over the years, Positive Money has been being a bigger and bigger emphasis on the threat of climate change. They also look at housing costs, which Steve has done, and they've looked at central bank buying government bonds and taking the initial stages for CBDC. I don't know how much of an influence you have, but those have evolved over the last few years, and you are listed as an advisor. So it appears that you're having quite an influence on the organization. Are you still an advisor for Positive Money?
Yeah, I'm not very active though. I mean, you've got to be in the UK to be active with them. And I was, close friends with some of the people who originally founded it. And I like the people inside them are a lovely bunch of people, actually. A lot of advocacy groups are fairly driven and ideological personalities. That's not the case with Positive Money. It's quite a success to the organization, how reasonably minded most people are who are members of it. So I have a lot of time for them on that front. But yeah, you go to occasional advisory meetings. I think my influence has mainly been through what I write rather than me advising them directly. But yeah, they are a group that I quite like.
They've certainly gone your direction, and their biggest concern right now is climate. So
yeah,
there's another voice out there saying the same things. Thanks so much.
Thanks, mate. See you tomorrow.
Maybe. I can get on. Take care.
Okay.
All right, we've got two more raised hands, and Steve, you had said you had 2 hours, so this may come in right at 2 hours. So let's bring in Giannis. Giannis, go ahead.
Thank you, Steve, and the rest of the attendees. It's a very fruitful discussion, and I don't share the pessimism because, we've been through an ice age, and quite successfully. I wouldn't wish it, to the current people, but people will adjust. But I don't think currently we're going to go into the ice age. I think fossil fuels will carbon capture way faster than renewables will. So I don't think we should be like the same way you have like we shouldn't have a monoculture of money, right? The same way we shouldn't have a monoculture like of energy or of technology. So we have to allow this diversity of economic paradigms to exist. And unfortunately, that cannot happen when you have monopolistic creation of money, which is what the government does. Okay, and the government is nothing but a private corporation. It's a bunch of private individuals with private interests who get corrupted, and they have their own agendas. There is nothing public about it. I think we should dispel that myth that there is anything public. Whenever everybody says something is public good, they are corrupt as hell. They're trying to sell you their private interest as your interest, and that doesn't pan out. So if we do, so I wanted to ask you, how do you envision money to be created? Like the way I see it is that the 19th century, the wildcat banking was the necessary evolutionary step for us to establish trust, which is the bedrock of an economy. Without trust, you have no transaction, right? But we stopped short from that evolutionary step, the 19th century. And then we created a central bank. So basically, we established a monopoly. And then we've been trying for 100 years to handle that. Now, it seems to me your idea, you don't like the 19th century world banking, but you want them kind of like a multiplicity, a plurality in money. So I'm kind of trying to square this
You're better
juggling.
off
Like,
to start with what I actually think, because you're wrong.
no. I don't know if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I mean that's the
You're
perception
wrong
I
about
have.
what I think. Yeah.
No. But
I
remember, you conveyed that you were not happy with 19th century when you were talking to
Yeah.
Mr.
yeah, that's true.
Perry.
I'm not.
You chastised him
Yeah, I'm not
for
happy
the
with that. Yeah.
You said we tried the 19th century and it was the wrong thing to do. You said.
Well, I'm actually saying not wrong in the 19th century. I'm saying wrong in principle. And funnily enough, I can actually quote Adam Smith on this front, because Adam Smith got involved in a debate with Jeremy Bentham over the rate of interest. And Bentham was in favor of a complete free market, charge whatever rate of interest you like. He would have been pretty much in favor of free market banking as well. And Smith's answer was that you actually want to have controls upon the rate of interest, because the only people who are going to be willing to pay much more than the average rate of interest are what he called prodigals and projectors. And he said the only people who are willing to take on that amount of money if you have a free market will be prodigals and projectors. Prodigals, you don't get your money back. They waste it in high living. Projectors will sell you a crazy scheme that's a fraud, and they'll get out of the way. And that is what I think happened with a large part of the wildcat banking system, because people think that wrong in principle is a definitive argument for authority, as opposed, come on, you were doing the same thing to me, saying beforehand, what was my authority for saying something? I'm saying that logically, what sort of people are we working with here? Do we work with real human beings, or we imagine we've got Nostradamus inside every one of us? The reality is we have real human beings who fall for simple schemes quite frequently. Get rich quick schemes and stuff like that wouldn't be an issue if people didn't fall for them. Now, if you have a private banking system where everybody's creating their own form of money, then the Austrian fantasy that I've seen so many times, I'm quite sick of it, is that people will therefore go with the responsible bank. No, they won't. They'll go with the bank that offers the highest rate of return. They'll pump
I
that bank
disagree
up
with
like
that.
crazy. Huh?
The
You
majority
disagree?
of people are responsible, and the majority of people do not fall for Ponzi schemes.
Yeah,
So
sure. That's why they voted for
no,
Trump.
no,
I'm
no, no, no.
sorry.
So people have to go through a
You have a
learning
vision of people's
curve.
behavior that I think is
Why don't you want to let people in society go through the learning curve?
the learning curve is already over.
Why?
Because we're about to have an ecological collapse caused by having
I
a
don't think so. Really?
Okay, well, you might not think so. I know more than you do on this topic. So
No, you
having a
don't. No, you don't.
You don't think so?
You
How many
don't.
thousand
You don't.
academic papers have you read on the topic?
I was a solar tomographer for NASA. Okay. So I know, and I know very well how climate modeling works, and I've worked in space weather prediction. Okay. So don't make assumptions about what people know and what people don't
You've
know.
corrected me on that. You've corrected me on that front, but I'm still saying I expect you. You seem to be more of an optimist than me about where we are. I don't think we've got long for a private experiment.
I'm not an alarmist.
Well, I am. Okay, let's just get that clarified. I think we're in for an alarming situation, and the idea that we have time for social experiments like this, I think, is simply wrong. He does not trust the people, pushing a particular religious dogma. Oh, for Christ's sake! I'm one of the most agnostic people you can meet. Well, I'm looking at the record, looking at what the climate scientists are telling me. I think if we're lucky, we've got 50 years. It's a bit late for social experimentation.
First of all, no. Let me correct you. The notion of climate is a concept, is a quantity which is defined over at least 500 years. So we only have about 130 years of data. So we don't even have the first data point about climate. Okay.
Have you seen we can
conjecture.
You say, come on, Giannis, let me interrupt you here. You say you're a scientist, say meteorologist. Have you seen the work on paleometeorology? Have you seen we've got records going back 2 million years? Okay.
Yes,
so you're saying we've only got 130 years of data. We've got 2 million years of good proxy data and 540
proxy. You said it, proxy data.
Yeah, sure. It's
that's
proxy.
still
we weren't there to measure
not
it.
science yet. It's scientific. It's not science yet.
Well,
Okay.
it won't be science until we're all dead anyway. So I'm sorry.
No, no, exactly. And
I'm sorry, if you're saying like
you want to make a sale right now because it serves you, right? Because you cannot wait for 100 years to make a sale on your alarmism. You have to make the sale now, right? You have to sell your solar panels now. You cannot wait. You understand? So you're conflicted yourself. Okay. So make your point, make your alarmism, but do not conjecture like knowledge supremacy because you don't. Okay, you cannot.
You're conjecturing knowledge supremacy is
No,
wrong, and I've
no,
got a.
no. I didn't say it's
I'm sorry.
one way or another. I didn't say one way or
Well,
another. You are saying one way.
okay, and I'm trusting a large number of climate scientists whom I know personally
Yeah,
over
okay,
you.
whatever. Yeah. They are
Okay.
corrupted way more. Scientists are corrupted way more than the
I think I've had
predecessor.
enough of
Okay.
this conversation.
You
Let's
you
have
flash
somebody
a
else
little
on the
money of
floor.
them, they will tell you whatever you need.
Whatever you believe. We're not going to. You're just
And they will fudge
you're
the
blowing hot air
data.
at me. And there's already enough in the
Josh,
They
atmosphere.
will fudge the data. They're human beings like
Dan-
you. Why you
Dennis,
idolize them? I
Dennis,
share your cynicism about humanity. I share that. So be equally cynic towards scientists as well. That's what I'm telling you.
okay,
You're
so
talking about
Josh,
some
shall
people I
we
know
move to
personally. I'm not going to be cynical about them. I know their values. Okay. Yep.
Josh, shall we move to the next speaker? And it looks like we're
Steve,
also running short of
do you
time.
have time for two more questions, or do we need to wrap it up now?
I can handle a bit longer. I've got a little bit of steam here, the way things are going anyway.
All right, appreciate it. All right, my good friend, Michael Meehan. If you want to join the screen, turn on your camera. If not, go right ahead and
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, terrific. So I am 100% a layperson here who kind of came across the Gessellian concept because of Josh, but I've also been reading a bit about myself. And as I listen to your conversations, it's interesting because just even this exchange between Giannis and Steve, I completely can see the frustration everybody has. And one of the things that I came on today kind of looking forward to hearing about, and I feel like I got a little bit of that, was trying to imagine how some of these systems would work. And Steve, one of the things that's striking me as, again, I don't claim to be any authority on anything, but I imagine whatever future climate crisis we have, which will happen soon, it's going to be issues of mass migration, societal collapse, and it will happen in the most hottest places, the coldest places. And as that happens, you'll have a breakdown of society. And we can see how that looks. Just take the Syrian migration into Europe and the struggles that's going to create. Not that I have a problem with any human being, just change is hard for people. As we can see, we're all struggling with change. But one of the things that Josh really kind of got me thinking about, and is that it's not as much about coming up with a system that everyone can just agree will work. Because you're making the point that, like, we're already, I mean, this train is going where it's going. And but as Giannis was saying, like, while that is true, you don't want to be as you want to be a little bit more optimistic about it. I live, my place might be beachfront property at the time that this happens. That's a bad joke. But as that collapse occurs, you think about like the Roman Empire collapsing. It didn't happen overnight. Just areas of control sort of disintegrated, and people kind of reverted to a darker period. Like there was less progress and so forth. And one of the things that interested me about a conversation that we had was the idea of coming up with a system that really doesn't require a lot of complexity for people to have a stable system for exchange, because that will still need to exist. I mean, obviously, if I'm the only person with clean water, I'm most probably going to be fighting for my life to secure it for myself and the amount of people that are there. But assuming that you have some regions of stability, and I would assume that's more logically that there'd be more of that than not in the earlier phases of this, that you would need, if you had a system that could kind of grow out of a place of anarchy or a place of instability where you actually have a kind of more just, prosperous core system. I feel like large economies to me are like always going to fail. There's just so much greed and corruption. But when you get to the smaller levels, there's just more natural exchange. And, like I live in a state in Vermont or in the US that's very small called Vermont. We have a very localized economy here. And it's interesting. It's like we're not really rich, we're not really poor, we've got a good quality of life. And often think about that. Some places like California, you make $300,000 a year, but you live in the same size house. It doesn't really
Yeah.
matter. And so in my mind, that economy, as again, as a layperson, can you see some place for a less perfect system, or would a Gisellian system, like I'm thinking of like a toolkit, like which I think Josh has mentioned before, that idea of, it doesn't even matter the governmental structure around it. It's just this idea that there's a monetary system which doesn't create this kind of inequality really rapidly. I guess that's my question.
Like we have no idea what's going to be on the other side of the ecological crisis we're rushing into. But what I can see is a collapse of advanced civilizations, advanced societies. You might know Nate Hagen's podcast. Nate has a podcast he calls The Great Simplification. And his point is that only simplified societies can possibly survive the type of decline we're going to go through. So, for example, silicon chips are probably the most obvious example of something that wouldn't be possible on a small scale society. And therefore, the whole technological system we're used to now would no longer exist. That sort of change. Now, that's huge because if you mentioned going us from the world where we're used to talking about the through computer screens, using software to create documents and arguments and analysis and so on, that there'd be none of that.
Of course.
And that's a huge reduction in the capacity we have to understand the world. My software has been built to understand the world. It needs a computer. Computer does exist. You can't understand the world. So it's a major issue. And I think we're a lot closer to it than most people realize. One little example of it, when it's Hurricane Milton, which I think is probably the world's best named hurricane, when Hurricane Milton hit North Carolina, it took out temporarily, hopefully, I think it's 2 or 3 mines there, which mine the purest silicon on the planet. And that silicon is used, silicon dioxide, I presume, quartz, is used to produce the stub that goes into a bath of silicon to pull out perfectly silicon crystals, which are a large part of manufacture of integrated circuits. We could, with 3 or 4 years of research, we could probably find a way to refine less pure versions of silicon to get the same result with a large amount more energy going in than goes into the mine. But, that's one storm potentially took out a capacity to make silicon chips. So that's how fragile we are. And then when the collapse occurs, what sort of societies will survive? It's going to have to be small groups that have an incredible level of interpersonal cohesion, and that means tribes. So we came from a tribal society. I think we'll return to a form of tribal society. It depends on the scale of operation of those societies, but in those you didn't need money because money was there because we didn't have a way of working out. We could handle working out trust relationships between 150 people, the classic Dunbar number. We couldn't do much more than that. So money evolved out of a need to know who you can and can't trust in a society of more than 7,000 individuals, and that's where it evolved from. If we end up in this sort of future society, we may be back in a world where money is no longer necessary. It's the organizing concepts behind a society that'll give it a chance to survive. So, I've speculated about all this stuff. I'll never get to see it, and I have no idea what's going to work. But I think money is going to be the least of our problems in that transitional society if we survive. If we get through it, if we can, if we find a way to rebalance the earth, which is feasible. There's some projects I want to see funded like Mirrors for Earth's energy rebalancing, and a range of other proposals I've heard that might give us a chance to reverse the heat damage we've done to the planet. That still is all the biodiversity damage and so on. Yeah, goodbye, Yanis. If you get out of here, I'm happy to see you go. Um, all this stuff is, it's scary. And the fact that people, think we still have time, I'm sorry. I hope I'm wrong. Okay?
Well, no,
But all the evidence tells I'm right.
so if I could just follow up there, Steve, I think in my mind that, like I said, one storm impacted this. I think there will be, I don't disagree that there could be really serious implications very quickly. But I do think that the point of that is the ability for people to adapt or to be able to exchange, let's say, and again, I mean, pessimistic, everything's going to go badly, but let's say that's a spreads of 500 years or 200 years before we're down to 10%. If people have stability, maybe this kind of race for this much, attainment of wealth won't be a thing. Because what Gessellian principles, kind of like this idea that Gesell puts out, at the end of the day, I don't think people need as much as they think they need. And so there's a part of me which I think, when you're not dealing with like a number in a bank account or on a ledger or on a computer, your wealth is just not, it's just not the same scale. So in some way, I'm just wondering if like you said, there is a process there. And so that's the thing that interests me about it. It just seems logical as a layperson that if you can't store money, you're going to use other things to reserve as wealth, and there's going to come a point where this is enough. I'm good, and if you don't have to worry about the issues that come along with the current system of currency and inflation on that high level and all of those things, it seems like you could have a situation where maybe humans logically kind of understand that there is a natural order of wealth versus this, I don't know, version we have now, which is just weird. As I mean that sense, you could have billions of dollars, which is just, when you think about it, is just mind blowing. But that seems like what everyone's shooting for.
Like I think that's a large part of our problem, because one of the motivations to try to accumulate huge amounts of wealth is that you want to insulate yourself against what can go wrong if you don't. Okay? Now, if you had a world which, if you think things go wrong and if you don't have that, you've still got a comfortable life. If you have public affluence rather than public squalor, as J.K. Galbraith put it, then you might have less pressure to accumulate large amounts of money. And one thing I certainly see when I travel from Europe to America is that the European, depends on the country, of course. I wouldn't put Greece in that category. They've been screwed by the euro too badly. But countries like the Netherlands, where I am now, the level of public provision is relatively high. And you don't therefore have this terrible feeling of, I don't make enough money, I'll starve to death tomorrow. So if you have decent public services, providing a minimum standard of living that is comfortable, that people can survive without needing to go beyond it, then you have less pressure to accumulate as well. And that'd be a preferable world from my point of view.
And the only thing I would add to that, though, is that in that example, I think that will be one of the first things that goes, is the support of these kind of governmental systems, any large scale systems, because everyone's fine until they're really hungry. But my point being is that when you get to a point where it's like, all right, I have to be independent and support myself, that's where that economic model really seems to make sense to me. So my point being is that the idea that there could be a system which a group of people could pick up that would allow them to trade on larger scales with people and have some system of trust would just be an interesting system. But I've really enjoyed the conversation overall. I do like spirited debate, and it is, also highly depressing, but I do want to be hopeful, particularly because Josh has a daughter and I have kids and we all have people we care about. But that idea that if things go sideways, is there something about both the Henry George model, which I'm learning about now, and which I think is a little bit more kind of in this current system. The jail cell seems like it's kind of could be independent, like it could be a like an algorithm you could plug into a smaller system. That's what interests me about it. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for all your comments, and I do appreciate even the contentious bits.
Thank you.
All right. Steve, I'll let you make the call on whether we field the last
Well,
two questions or whether
We'll
we,
do Peter first of all, because Peter hasn't had a go yet, and then Ed at the end there.
okay.
Mine will be short.
Peter, do you want to join this? If so, turn on your camera. There you
Yeah.
go.
All right.
Okay.
So, I guess, thinking about austerity and scarcity, the artificial scarcity of money, and therefore the need for austerity. I think that discussion and all of its instruction that you've given us and so forth, it would really help to put that in a larger context, something that, for example, Yanis Varoufakis is really good at. He's really good at getting the big picture.
Yep.
And I'm thinking really kind of vanilla flavored Keynes, in terms of deficit countries and surplus countries, in terms of trade and beggar thy neighbor policies and savings glut, hoarding the savings, instead of paying your workers enough so that they could purchase, things that they make, and that they could purchase what other countries can export. So you have the comparative advantage, working, Ricardian advantage and so forth. So we don't have a system where David Ricardo is happy. He's unhappy right now because there's so much beggar thy neighbor going around, and beggar thy neighbor economics really helps to inflate assets in deficit countries. So the U.S. real estate market, financial markets, and so forth have risen exponentially since Bretton Woods collapsed in '71. And I don't know much about Australia and the UK as compared to the US, but I'm sure that assets there have also risen far beyond the ability of incomes to really purchase them without going into debt, households. So it's like the Ravel model somehow needs to be integrated into a larger description, non-mathematical, non-accounting description, if you will, that the average person that Josh so eagerly wants to include can understand. And again, if I'm sure everyone here, you know how Yanis Varoufakis is. He's got a silver tongue, and
he's a good mate too, by the way.
Yeah, and so so imagine him at his best moment, incorporating Ravel and all this stuff. But without vanilla flavored Keynes, without the understanding of what his original Bretton Woods attempted to accomplish, with the Bancor and so forth, with a neutral currency, international currency. And I mean, capitalism is a joke, in my opinion. Then you're still in mercantilism,
Peter, can you summarize your point? It's going for too long. Sorry.
Okay, I'm speaking to people who have a little bit of knowledge of economics. I'm sorry. So that's it. So my suggestion is, Steve, if you could make your pitch for Ravel with a larger context in mind. And do you ever do that? Where can we see that being done?
Like that's what I'm trying to build an alternative economics of overall. Obviously, I think I've done it, but I haven't yet extended it to include trade. Ravel the software can cope with multiple currencies, so we can actually model. But in terms of making it as straightforward to model the global system as I can model the national, it still involves a lot of effort by the programmer, the developer. So it's a major limitation at the moment. But yeah, we need Ricardo, by the way, I'm very unhappy with Ricardo because the whole idea of comparative advantage is yet another economic myth. Because he presumed you could move machinery between industries as easily as you move people. I'm sorry, you can't. And that's one of the major fallacies of that particular neoclassical theory, which the neoclassicals happily adopted that from Ricardo. But yeah, you do need to have a system like Keynes try to get with the Bancor to limit how much countries can run up trade surpluses, to stop bigger than neighbors type policies, etc., etc. So all that stuff is necessary for a functional system. But we're going to go into this crisis with a system which is already dysfunctional, and that's what that's why one reason for my pessimism about the future.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's a good place to put a pin in it. Steve, thank you so much for joining us and helping us kick off this series. Like I mentioned at the top, our next episode will be December 3rd at 1 p.m. with Tim Jenkin, a fascinating human being. You will not want to miss that. So hope we'll see you all there. And this video will be posted on YouTube sometime in the near future. So thanks you all for Steve. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Okay, bye all. Okay.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye.
Right.